sociology. I took my bachelor's degree in journalism at Northwestern University in 1957. And spent 4 years of work with the editorial board in Chicago. And after switching over to radio and television news for a couple of years, I decided that I didn't want to spend my life working as a rewrite person for AP and UP and INS, at that point 3 major news services in the country. So I was doing some work as a minor in sociology at Northwestern, and I liked the ways in which these 2 instructors, Wendell Bell was one of them, but I guess more important for me was Raymond Mack, where they approached subject matter of social life. Particularly, they raised questions about an excessive individualism of American society, which seemed to me to be a fitting characterization of what I saw at Northwestern. And they made it attractive to talk about human life from a more social group perspective. So I sort of gravitated towards this field. So I came to the back door. It wasn't as though I started off in sociology. I went to UCLA for a joint degree in anthropology and sociology. It was at that point a joint department in 1957 with Wendell Bell, because he had just made that move. And there was some financial assistance at that time. Because there was, for the next 5 years for me, I had a very easy time in graduate school, golden years of sociology. And at that point that I came up for the first time against a critique of the field, which I didn't understand, which was to later on shape my own views about discipline. And that was the positivists who originally captured my interest. That is, I thought that you could simply describe social life from a perspective of some distance and analyze it and then make sense of it. And some of my graduate student peers and senior students would get these arguments with me. I remember a passionate argument about the extent to which one can take a stance apart from one's social subject matter. And I took the, I think at that point, naive and young view that this would be described a phenomenon from some detached, objective position, as if one were a physicist. And depending upon the trivia of the subject matter, that probably is true. But I remember having the argument, and I thought I didn't lose. I thought the argument proceeded in a certain logical fashion. And I don't recall losing the argument. But somehow, seeping into my consciousness over the next few years, I changed my own mind. But I don't recall a conversion experience. What I recall is seepage of this notion that I later on adopted as rather critical to my own stance. Namely, that social life is also moral order. Apart from social life and make critical observations of it. If social structure is moral order, then one's stance upon that is not simply detached and analytic.
Okay, with regard to your earlier this developing interest in a kind of approach to social subject matter, with regard to that phase and your current kind of operations, could you, through perhaps a description of a brief history of the institute for which you're a director, give us some idea as to whether your outlook upon this kind of approach has changed or very developed?
Sure. Back in the late 60s, a period of a lot of student activity on Berkeley campus, a number of social scientists got together, among them Bob Blahnik, who's still here, Nathan Glaser, who later went to Harvard, Shelley Messenger over in the law school now, Lloyd Street, who is now at Cornell. We got together and we decided that the time had come for the University of California to produce an organized research unit studying the problem of race in America. And that was a period of community involvement for students. And so in a very short time, within I think 2 years from its original meeting in 1967, within 2 years, the Institute for Race and Community Relations had started. Now that institute had a sketchy history for the next 6 or 7 years, which I think probably not much purpose is served in detailing, except to say that in the first couple of years, they had a very hard time getting a white academic to be the director, and yet there were people who were the naturals in terms of their subject area. So right away, you have an instance where the natural trajectory of the academic scientific enterprise would produce a white investigator, but the political, social structure of the period made it impossible. So Winthrop Jordan, in history, wouldn't or couldn't take it. Bob Blauner in sociology wouldn't or couldn't take it. I could name at least 10 people on the campus whose area of expertise was race, who, given the objective stance of the disciplines, should have been the natural choices. But it was hot and angry and black in that period. The Panthers were right next door and often on the campus, and whites just wouldn't take over a study of race. So they asked Lloyd Street, who at the time was a senior grad student in sociology. Lloyd was in his 40s at the time. He'd been a professional community worker in Los Angeles, had been around, and so the natural competence. He took it over. Because he was a graduate student, he had a hard time getting the funding going from either the federal government or from his colleagues, who obviously were on the faculty, who felt a little bit, I think, reluctant to bring in their research monies into this institute that was newly formed. So, anyway, to make a long story very abbreviated, a few years Lloyd tried. It didn't work out very well. The next few years, they had another black student take it over. Didn't work out at all in terms of funding. Another 3 years went by, and a professor in education took it over, and he had a heart attack. It was 1975, 76. And in that period, I had been on the advisory committee to the chancellor and the dean of the graduate division, what to do about this continuous thorn that was. And I had been meeting with other people, including David Monson, several people from around the Bay Area, with a group that wanted to talk about an institute, a kind of what do I call it, a piece of turf. People could do ethnographic or field research, or community research in the natural setting, and yet feel that they were continually challenged by the positivist critique, that one could assume that you were already at stage 2 or 3. Now your critiques would come from those who believed that that kind of research was legitimate. You didn't have to always get up and say why you weren't developing testable hypotheses. You could assume that your audience understood that the world was more complex and trying to quickly come to some hypothesis testing as an advanced science. So people like Laura Nader and John Osborne in anthropology, and Jerry Berriman, Bob Blauner, Herb Bloomer in sociology, Dave Monson, myself, Harley Hochschild, and a number of others who were mentioned here, all decided that we could put together this institute. The administration, at that time, the dean of the graduate division was Sandy Elbert. The administration heard that we wanted to do something and decided that now was the time to move this institute. Race and Communities had been sitting there lying fallow for many years. So they asked me if I would take it over, and I said, well, if there was a change of name, a change of purpose, a change of direction, a widening of the mandate, keeping race at the important, but not the exclusive enterprise of the Institute, then I would be happy to take it over. So there was a compromise worked out. I would take it over for a period of a year and widen the mandate, change the place, change the names. And that's what happened.
So that gives a kind of an introduction to the developments, but thinking more about the change of emphasis, as you've suggested, from a race-specific institute to a more general, with race as maybe one of the priorities amongst several. What were the reasons underlying your own? In fact, I'm thinking of two kind of sets of reasons. Could you comment on whether you felt this was more politically tactful, or whether you felt it to be central to a thrust of empirical investigation?
Remember, this group that was meeting in the middle 70s was not concerned with race as such. So there was a natural development that most of us would want to widen the mandate. But in essence, it was not political. It was simply our intellectual interests were much wider than the study of race. But even those who wanted to study race would have said something like this. The tendency is for racial analysis in America to focus upon ethnic and racial minorities. There were studies of Asian Americans by Asian American graduate students, studies of Hispanic populations, either Cuban, Puerto Rican, Chicano populations by people from those communities. Tendency for them to be studying the local scene. Remember, the issue was ethnography and field work. They had a natural inclination for people to study the group, the community, without, we thought, understanding the larger social, economic, political frame of ethnic minority status. So to study race without studying the structure of power that produced racial groups at the base of the structure was not very productive, not very fruitful. So the major purpose was to study race inside of a larger frame context of, I suppose the popular term now is macro, political, macroeconomic structures. But it was to widen the parameters, widen the horizons of the discourse, away from simply a study of this black community in this small town or this Asian community.
So as I understand it, you're saying it was a broadening, so as to say, to start from the sense that let's not study racial groups, but let's study groups in situations which come to be defined as racial groups.
That partly, but as well to study up, to use Laura Nader's phrase, that one looks at decisions by banks to redline, study what the IMF does to create situations in the third world that produce people who come here to find salvation. I mean, that's the widest parameter of the study, to study up. You study power sources to understand the creation and formation of racial and ethnic minorities. Why are Chicanos coming across the border to form these migrant groups and so forth? Why are people from the Caribbean going to England? Well, if you only look at what's happening in England, at this little community in London or Manchester, and you don't see that that's a function of forces outside of England, then you've missed the basic generation of an understanding.
So there was was it a conscious move to use it in the current language, very conscious to attempt to link the micro with the macro? Was that a...
That was explicit and conscious. Remember the 60s. The 60s was a period in which a lot of the students who came here, who were black, Chicano, and later in the 70s Asian, had a strong commitment, almost inexorable style, to study their own community. So if a black student came and wanted to study theory, there was some modest and moderate snickering in the background. And this theory that was not concerned with the black community was seen in the 60s and early 70s as strange behavior. So almost all the Asian students studied Asian communities, and blacks studied black communities. Okay? The explicit decision at the Institute was to try to get these students to both study the micro scene of the particular community in which they were invested in doing intellectual work, and to widen the parameters slowly and gradually to include large-scale transformations in the demography of their situation, look at patterns of employment, unemployment, but it's to not just look at the scene, but to widen. And we had some particular strategies which would include historical work. You would tell the student to spend at least a few weeks, not a few months, doing some historical comparative work. How did this community come to be? Which immediately takes them into, they're doing very good history, into the history of the political, economic circumstances of that group. So it begins to widen right away. So the history of it was one necessary feature of good work at the Institute, history of the community. Then, of course, the structural circumstance, which usually meant where were they in the economic order, where is this group economic, what's the pattern of employment, what part of the economy is this community likely to be employed in, which takes them quite quickly to the level of regional economy, possibly into the national economy. So what begins as that community is broadened quickly to include these other features. So it was an explicit decision on the part of the International Institute to develop a training program which would take this form.
And would you also imply that it would be interdisciplinary?
The university actually required the Institute to start interdisciplinary. Now, once you're inside the Institute, you can, of course, choose to go off into your narrow confines, but we, as a funding decision, joined up with anthropology and developed the United States Training Program as an ecumenical, broad-based program, which later on was to include public health, political science, urban and regional planning. We've had good students in about 8 disciplines over the years.
So this, as I'm understanding, I mean, the decision to, the change of emphasis or the change of focus, the broadening of the focus, was a conscious decision based or predicated on the basis of a belief that in order to understand local situations, one must frame them in the midst of the broader social influences.
Yes.
Okay. Can we stop a minute and say something? Did we want to just go right? It's fair to say, Troy, that there are varying methodologies and methods of investigation used by the different researchers who carry out research at the Institute. Could you give us an idea of the range of research methods and the kind of factors underlying choice of these particular methods?
There is a range of methods. However, central to all the projects is this strong injunction that we do research with a core element in the natural setting. That is, each of the projects has a component where the principal investigator or some key actors in the research setting spend time, usually as little as 6 months, maybe as much as 3 or 4 years, in the field. And there is a methodological, perhaps epistemological reason for that as the core activity. Now, other kinds of research enterprises, the historical comparative strategy, the analysis of survey data which corresponds to or supplements or is a concentric circle around that core, are all integrated features of the research. Right? So I really want to emphasize the core feature of natural setting work and the other work as ancillary. Now, all my colleagues won't agree with that, but that's my strong view. And there are variations. That is, some research at the Institute would take the form of interview data. 6 months of long interviews, 2 hours, 3 hours with different people. That's one project. In which case, there is no one on the grounds for a 6-month period in detail, just an observation. You're simply going and interviewing every week or so. That's one project. Another project is 3 years, 4 years in length, and the members who are on the research team are on the longshore in grievance meetings or on the longshore in the hole for that long a period, understanding what's going on. So I don't want to make it sound like, on the one hand, there's a historical project over here, and they're concerned with document analysis, and on the other hand, there's interview material here. There are different emphases, but the common core is this deep concern for ethnographic, long-term observation, from whence there then springs this concentric circle of other kinds of ancillary activities.
Am I right in assuming that natural setting necessarily means local setting?
No. Natural setting means you try to observe the behaviors of people in the situation in which it routinely occurs. And that's to be distinguished from either a laboratory situation in which you put up the situation artificially and you ask people to simulate how they would behave, or a situation where you walk in for a few hours or a few days where people know that you're there and therefore they change their behavior because you're there. Natural setting research means that you spend time in such a long-term setting that people can't literally afford to change their behavior. If you go to the factory and you're spending 2 or 3 years there, the people in the factory can't literally afford to change all their behavior because you're there. That's what I mean natural setting. So
Okay.
it could be, and often is, we have students spending time in the Southwest, and fields. We have students in doctors' offices watching, observing behavior and practice in the field.
Yeah.
It could be in New York or it could be in Paris.
And the strength of this, or one of the strengths of this message you're suggesting is that by being able to watch people and to listen to what people claim they do and compare it with what they actually do, that gives you a better overall perspective on the
It
situation.
gives us a focus, not a better perspective, it gives us a focus and a way of being honest about the next level of investigation. Because now what I want to do is talk about natural setting research as core, but insufficient. Because if you leave it only at the level of, I observe this group in this situation, and you don't try to incorporate larger themes, whether you call it empirical generalization, development of postulates, that's the strategy and style. But I think the issue is, how do you begin to frame the observation in ways that make sense across time and space for different groups? So my objection to the natural setting method is that it inclines people to say that they've studied this scene and now they understand this scene. Well, that seems to me to be anti-intellectual, ahistorical, and for the most part trivial and too time specific. You study the natural setting as core in order to make sense of larger issues. So, what are the larger issues? Regional,
Well,
national.
if I may interject here, 2 questions. What are the larger issues, and in what ways do you get information about the larger issues? And thirdly, relate it or interrelate the two?
Well, again, you get different answers from different people, but my view is that one doesn't just proceed inductively and say, where does the situation locally take me? Where does the scene take me? We come to the natural setting with a series of underlying assumptions, sometimes more explicit than other times. But we certainly have ideas about what's at issue in a local scene. And for me, the economic and political are the central macro issues, and then the question is, how does one begin to frame political and economic analysis of local research scenes? That, for me, is both a macro and deductive strategy, and because the natural setting is the core, there is some basic, what do I call it, corrective, basic corrective from imposing too much theoretical, top-down interpretive strategy upon scene. Now I come to a matter of some controversy, because some people will say you can find the macro theory in any micro scene. If you approach the micro scene with a theoretical formulation and you look hard enough, you will find it. So there's no corrective, there's no guarantee, in any case, observation. And my response is, while that's true, there are steps that can be taken, intermediate between the micro-observation and the macro-theorizing, which keep you a little more honest than simply defining out of reality things that don't fit and say, well, that's trivial or that's epiphenomenal. You know, it's very convenient for a theorist to look at the micro scene and say, if I don't see a fit, or I don't see, I'll call that an epiphenomenon. So the strategy, I think, to at least mitigate that tendency is to talk about intermediate levels between the macro and the micro. That is, levels of empirical observation and theoretical development, which force the analyst to deal in between this macroscopic conception of the universe and some micro scene of a small little laundry or a bank or a mental hospital or a real estate agency or a longshore grievance hall. I mean, those things are too local and specific. On the other hand, a grand theory can fit everywhere.
It's suggested by a number of scholars that when a scholar approaches a situation, he or she approaches it with a number of values, a number of assumptions, a number of postulates which are brought into play when they define the situation, they construct the methodology. Would you agree with that in general, that a number of values are brought into the situation, whether one accepts it or not?
Well, no question that that's true, although what I would say is it's much truer about social life than about, let's say, natural life. That is, the social scientist has a much stronger bias about social life that he or she is observing than, let's say, the natural scientist about the natural world. That is, it seems to me one can talk about a description of rocks and water in ways that do not force social structural assumptions of justice and injustice, equality and inequality upon that life. Now, I'd be the first to say that the biologist or the physicist brings to the natural world a series of assumptions about social life and about human life that make water or rocks meaningful. But that's one level removed from my observation that the social scientist, even more so, can't simply see social life without these deep assumptions about equality, justice, politics, gender, all those things are of interest in the theory.
Yeah. Are you saying that the social scientist has more assumptions than the natural scientist, or that they are assumptions of differing kinds?
The assumptions of the social scientists deeply penetrate theories of social life in ways that need to be examined, and then, after examined, made relevant for whatever work is proceeding. I think for the physicists, the choice of questions are sociologically interesting. But that's a different order. I mean, I don't know we want to get into the sociology of science here, but I think there's a difference in the order of construction for the two phenomena. Because physical order is not moral order. Social order is moral order. And that's my parting of the ways, of course, with positivism.
Can we backtrack a little and go back over where you were talking about the specific research relationships? Could you give us a practical example, for example, of a study or a type of study which has been done at the Institute with respect to utilizing these different levels from the core research up to more macro dimensions?
Well, I suppose the easiest thing to talk about is my own work, geotechnology and genetics and microbiology. So let me just take a quick example of the ways in which the approach is made to gene screening, genetic screening for sickle cell anemia in the United States for American blacks, and in Orchomenoi, Greece, for the small village of Greeks. Now, if I were to stay only at the local level and talk about how American blacks screen, how they see genetics, what I would see would be the ethnicization of the disease, because blacks are the ones who have sickle cell in America. And when medical and health officers in this country talk about sickle cell, they always preface it with discussions about the nature of the community of the risk population, and that's blacks. This influences the ways in which gene screening is done. So, just a quick example now. We learn with mother's milk that it's just a matter of time and education, that science will pursue these disease entities, will solve the problems, and race is not very important. But if you go close up to the local scene, you'll see that the decision to fund gene screening or gene therapy is a political decision. In the hospital, you can't see that. You only stay at a small hospital doing gene screening. That never occurs to you as a problem. If you move, however, to the level of Washington, D.C., and see how funding decisions are made, you'll see that a small group of very prominent physicians testifying before the Kennedy Committee in 1975 made a decision to fund a certain kind of research strategy, which was to affect the whole development of gene screening, which you couldn't see at the local level. On the other hand, if you only stay at the Washington-based level, what you can't see at the local level is that something called informed consent is always problematic. You stick with the ethicists in their philosophical chairs, they'll tell you that we have to have informed consent with gene screening. And having never been to a clinic, never seen the exchange between the gene counselor and the client, they don't understand that most genetic screening is done under the rubric of the white-coated scientist, or MIDIC, who says this is the best way to proceed. Sign here. Now, just quickly on the comparative aspect. In Orchomenoi, Greece, they've discovered that there is a group of people with the rate of sickle cell double that of American blacks. And these people are Greeks. They don't consider that their problem in any way as a black problem. There are no blacks in this whole area. But they've taken on a kind of pariah status, the ones who are screened. And so, if one only sees it in some small and narrow confines of a genetic disease, you have no way of understanding such matters as the delivery of medical services to these people, stigma, where blame winds up being located between male and female, the invocation of the gods, and so on. Just an anecdote to dramatize the problem of the differences. I have a Jewish friend, an MD in this country, who told me a few years ago that his colleagues were very concerned, and some of them came to him and said, "What's a nice Jewish boy like you doing studying sickle cell anemia, a black disease, when there is Pesach, which is, of course, a reflection for Ashkenazi Jews?" Well, he told it to me with some humor and some distance, but he then talked later about the way in which his career had been shaped by the fact that he's a very well-known hematologist interested in sickle cell anemia, while a number of his colleagues had taken off in a different route. Now that couldn't come up as a question in Greece, nor can we. One simply studies the phenomena of the disease. One doesn't talk about the stratification of the medical profession, whether or not one is studying sickle cell or beta thalassemia. They're both in Greece, but there is no social, structural, no resource differentiation, whether one is studying beta thalassemia, sickle cell anemia in Greece. In America, it's profound. It shapes the way in which the disease itself will be funded.
So it also and it's those realities which shape the direction of the research project.
Yes.
SSC history from the last cassette, so we won't be saying it. Initiate the discussion with an outline by you of the current methods and objectives of the Institute, and focus initially on how you foresee the Institute's program, Institute's methods developing, and in that way to enable you to elucidate to us the kind of why you've chosen those particular methods, how they relate to what are the objectives of the Institute's work, how you envisage the methods achieving those objectives, and then we'll come on to the values or the nature of subject matter in the research, kind of militating against your achieving those those objectives. And then we'll kind of, as the interview goes along, we'll be able to, once or twice, I'll kind of say, well, with regard to the future program, we know that you've undertaken a certain piece of research, either the genetic screening, or could you briefly tell us how that was organized, and then how you envisage future research going. Now, I said, Bob laid this on me last night, so I said, well, we'll give it a try, because I've got everything organized in terms of what you've done, so we feel that will better enable you to elucidate why you've chosen.
We can do this. We can always listen. It's only celluloid.
Yeah.
So we can always just rip it off and put another one in it.
Yeah. That's what we said. We'll go with this one, and it should go okay. And then, if it all crumbles, we've still got another hour.
Yeah.
We've got to do it by next Friday.
And Friday or a week from Monday?
Yeah. Well, you said you wanted it by Friday, so you could have the tape to edit over the weekend.
Over the weekend we can edit them.
Yeah.
Okay, as long as we know that we can edit out some of the nonsense, we can.
Okay.
Good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Troy, on behalf of my colleagues and myself, we'd like to thank you for giving us the time to interview you. We know that you're very busy, and we do appreciate it. We've had the benefits of watching our graduate colleagues interviewing your faculty colleagues, and we'd like to take the opportunity to make our purpose in the interview as clear as possible. Our primary interest is to elucidate and clarify the particular methodological stance which you've adopted in your work as a sociologist, in your work in the Institute, and to look at the reasons for this choice. We're interested in how your choice of methods relates to the objectives of sociology and to the objectives of social research as you see them, and to the problems which may arise in achieving these objectives. An underlying issue in all this is our concern to raise the question, to shed light on the question as to whether the nature of the sociological enterprise differs fundamentally from the nature of research of science in the natural sciences. We've heard something about the history of the Institute for the Study of Social Change, and we'd like to organise the discussion around some of the present programmes of research, the present projects which are currently underway. I've taken the opportunity to look at your annual report, and in the annual report you state that the objective of research in the Institute is to focus on the community in the natural setting in which social behaviour typically occurs, that you've got various projects converging around the theme of social transformation, and that these projects are documented by direct observation. With regard to some of these objectives, would you like to outline the various projects that are underway?
I can do that. We can just start off by saying something about the nature of the research that goes on here in general.
Yeah.
I think that the difference between research in this institute and places typically in the country doing similar kind of research stems from almost epistemological difference in orientation. Back in the 50s, there was a distinction made in the philosophy of science that was very well understood and often part of debate. Now, people didn't agree, but they at least debated the topic, and that was the difference between emergence and reductionism. Now, the reductionist position stated that you could understand a phenomenon by looking at its component parts. So that if you had something called social behavior, you might look at individual behavior, and then subsidiarily, chemical behavior, or maybe perhaps even the gene code, to explain what was happening. The emergence debate segment took the opposite view. There was something about the character of social life which was intrinsically different, that you couldn't understand the phenomena by looking at its component parts. That in the parlance of the everyday life, that some of the ingredients was greater in every way than by looking at the component parts. Right? Something happens at a configuration of social life that makes it irreducible to its subsidiary parts. So that would be, I think, almost shibboleth, a statement about the point of origin of a study of social change in this institute, that we are rather much dramatically on the side of the emergence argument, that you can't simply look at social phenomena by its subparts to explain what's happening. Now, let me just talk about institute projects in these terms, and you can see where that might lead us. When people have done studies in the last decade trying to explain criminal behavior or deviance, what they've often done is to try to explain with small variables. They'll take a particular sub-feature of a crime called homicide, and they'll say, well, how many times does the act occur in this part of the society, this part of the house, even with Wolfgang's study? And they'll attempt to explain homicide with reference to the most minute variables, which it seems to me have no sociological standing. So what we've tried to say is, let's pull back from this, now you catch my bias, this mindless empiricism, and talk about the nature of activity, which is to be explained by a sociological point of view. So now homicide is not simply the fragmented, isolated phenomena of a particular actor in a certain part of the house or society. It's to be framed by social analysis. So now, homicide, it's natural setting. You can't simulate homicide and try to understand it. That is, you can't put people in a room as the Milgram experiments tried to do, to simulate aggressive behavior. And try to understand why, for example, most people in the society who commit homicide, by official statistics, tend to be blind. You can't get the analysis out of the Milgram studies. Okay? But you might be able to understand homicide if you talked about the larger economic political frame in which people live. I use that as an introductory example because my own research is on new technology in microbiology and genetics, recombinant DNA research. And that appears at the moment, at the surface, to be a contradiction. That is, why should I be concerned with the study of genetics, which is the almost ultimate reductionist position in the study of social and human behavior? Well, it's because of the remarks I made earlier. Namely, it seems to me that what's happened in society is that because of the failure of sociology to make the compelling point that you cannot reduce human behavior to its component parts to explain it, the society has gone down a path to receiving this notion that the new technology in genetics might well explain much of human behavior. And the resurgence of sociobiology as an intellectually respectable discipline, even among college undergraduates in sociology, that resurgence speaks so loudly to the problem of the failure of the discipline to convince people that there's something emergent.
I see. So could you give us an outline of some of the particular projects that you've undertaken and how these projects exemplify the study in the natural setting?
All right, let's take the study of the Longshore, which is probably the longest standing single empirical study in the Institute. For 6 years now, David Motz, David Wellman, and some others in the Institute have worked on the Longshore. And as you might expect from what I said earlier, their commitment is to doing research in the natural setting. They want to understand what's happened to the transformation of the longshoremen's political consciousness. Back in the 30s and the 40s, there was the most radical union, possibly the most radical union in the United States. Self-consciously progressive, often accused by the center of being communist-dominated, certainly a political force on the West Coast. Over time, the union was changed, and by the early 70s, its membership no longer had this radical commitment. So Motz and Wellman took it upon themselves to try to explain it. They could have done so by talking about the transformation of the nature of work, by reading about what's happened on the Longshore. After all, people knew about containers coming in. But by going onto the Longshore for 3 years of work, spending time in the grievance halls, watching what happens in the hole down deep in the deck, Wellman and Motz began to get a picture of the shifting consciousness of the longshoremen, which I think can only be put together by talking about a mosaic. Here's what I mean. Unlike other studies of a longshoreman community, which take the component parts, look at each one. What's happened with the connection between, let's say, the Teamsters and the longshoremen. That's one component. That's a whole series of studies. Unlike these kinds of fragments, the Motz-Wellman study was to take a look at grievance procedures and then expand into larger issues of how the grieving longshoremen about, for example, who gets to work under what conditions, how that expanded to include the economy of the longshore. So that took them into the maritime industry. They might have asked certain kinds of questions of the maritime industry officials had they not seen that the grievance on the longshore led them to expand their horizons to include a particular set of questions. So they began to get a mosaic about political transformation by being in the natural setting.
Okay, fine. It's being suggested by some, you've suggested that research in the natural setting is the best way to get at the kind of problems that you're concerned with in this area. It's been suggested by some that survey research is a superior method of research, would it not be possible for yourself or your colleagues to undertake some kind of initial empirical investigation of the sort you've described, and then design a survey which would give you information of the sort that you need?
Well, that of course is the conventional wisdom. For several years I sat on the Research Funding Board in Washington, and the routine statements that are made is that ethnography, field research, community research, those things are preliminary. You get your hypotheses honed up. That's pre-science. And then you go in with your real instruments and you find out what's really happening. Right? So I would think that that's true for a very small proportion of the projects that were funded. I can see a situation where that might be true. But there are some situations in which you can't possibly understand by the survey technique what is going on. That is, depending upon the question that you're raising, you can't answer that question empirically with a survey technique. Now, we use an example in the article that Mott and Wellman and I wrote, an example which I think makes the point. Let's say one is doing a study of whether or not there is housing discrimination in the society. If you raise the question with a survey, you simply spread questionnaires out or ask people to go out with interview schedules to find out whether or not people discriminate in housing. Because of the structure of the social organization of society, namely lawsuits, landlords being afraid of saying anything about that, of course, that technique will not answer the question about discrimination. That is, what is said to be a scientific technique, survey research, winds up being a complete distortion of empirical reality. But if you want to get at housing discrimination, you must abandon that technique and get one which will get at discrimination, which means natural setting research. You have to get people, as housing office did, to go out to the world in which housing discrimination occurs. They paired white couples and black couples, and they found something quite different than you get from a survey. Namely, they found that people discriminated routinely in certain parts of the society. Now, I would argue that that's not a pre-scientific instrument. That's the only instrument that would work. Okay?
Yes.
So to call survey research more scientific or less depends entirely upon the question that you're raising.
Okay, so you've made it clear that the kind of methods that one uses would depend on the nature of the question that's raised. I think you've suggested that part of the problem in choosing techniques depends on how individuals will respond or react to the fact that they're being interviewed or they're being researched. That's something I'd like to come back to later. You've mentioned several times the term scientific. We're particularly interested to find out what it is about social research which is scientific. How would you distinguish it, for example, from an ad hoc study which put together a number of tentative hypotheses and went out, studied them in a certain order and proposed a new thesis? With regard to particularly the natural setting, what is particularly scientific about that kind of research?
Well, I would array things on a continuum. As I would not talk about what is not scientific. I think that this binary distinction is an unfortunate one that happens too often in sociology and probably in the natural sciences as well. Projects, it seems to me, are not either one or the other. One can talk about the mix of methods, the mix of the kinds of investigative techniques, points of orientation, points of entry into the field, which make it more or less scientific. So I guess I wouldn't want to respond to the question in terms of whether a project is or is not a scientific project. Having said that, let me begin to qualify what kinds of issues and problems make an investigation more scientific, right?
Yeah.
The most obvious one is the extent to which it gets at an empirical representation of the concept. So we take my example I used a minute ago of discrimination. If the topic is discrimination, what you want is an instrument which gets at that empirical phenomenon. And if you have an instrument which gets away from it, as I used in the example, that instrument is anti-scientific. Right?
Yeah.
It is non-scientific. So the first response on the continuum is that you have to have an instrument which attaches as best it can the theoretical construct to the empirical referent for that construct. And the best or better instruments scientifically are the ones which close that gap. The second question then becomes comparative. To what extent can one make statements about these empirical relationships which seem to be enduring, as opposed to use your term, ad hoc? You only know that, for example, over time and across space. So it seems to me that one begins to do scientific work by comparing different points historically, what happens over time as you watch this empirical referent and this concept together relate to different kinds of relationships. Right? If you have, like an old model, if you have more of this, you get less of that over time. That's one model of the scientific enterprise. The other one is comparative across different categories at the same time.
Okay, fine. With regard to the comparative aspect, it's often been suggested that research of this kind in the natural setting enables the individual researcher or researchers to distort the nature of the information that they've collected. What kind of measures, what kind of procedures exist to enable testing of like with like?
Well, there's a tendency in natural setting research for there to be something called a classic. One does a bit of research and becomes a classic. So let's take Talley's Corner. My answer to your question is that ethnic ethnography ought to produce many like kind of studies so that classics don't exist. One shouldn't have a conception of, in the terms of Talley's Corner, one street corner society and call that a representation of the empirical problems of black men trying to get jobs. My solution to the problem would be have 20 Talley's Corners located at different points in, obviously, space and in time. So that one goes back to the same corner of a period of several years, or one has a Talley's Corner in Philadelphia, Chicago, Newark, Los Angeles, and so forth. Now, if we had 20 different Talley's Corners, we could begin to see by a comparative technique what kinds of strategies of seeking employment or street corner life begin to become a pattern. We then have the basis for empirical regularities and the basis of some solid generalizations. The generalization becomes possibly a conceptual device for understanding the situation. So it seems to me that the real problem in ethnography lies in the tendency for one study to become a classic, to be seen as the representation of that whole phenomenon. And then one forgets it. One forgets the phenomenon because one else has the classical study.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. Relating that to the particular objectives of the Institute, how would you organize the individual studies that you undertake? How would they relate to each other? How would they relate, given that the Institute is in itself conducts research of a limited nature by its very the nature of its resources? How does that relate to research of similar types, for example, in other institutes?
Well, the issue is one of resources, and the best that one can do is to try to begin to do a model kind of research, and then hope that the model will become sufficiently compelling that other institutes, other research projects around the country might pick them up. Let's say I do a study of genetic screening in a clinic in San Francisco and a clinic in Chicago. If that's compelling, then rather than that standing for the classic study of all gene screening, perhaps in the next few years, you'll find studies in another 5 or 6 cities, which can then be used to provide this comparative mosaic, and one gets a picture of the phenomenon. Now, there is no way that I can guarantee, when I'm doing my research or having others in the institute pursue their project, where I can guarantee that these works will come together in this good fit. I think that, therefore, the choice of topics is the important theoretical, empirical, and political question. How does one decide what to study? What kind of criteria do you use? Might be the best formulation. And I think one has to step back from that question as a researcher and answer it rather forthrightly.
How do you decide, with regard to the future, the current and future program, how do you decide amongst the limited resources that we've got? What criteria do you use to decide which are the best projects to undertake? How do they relate to the particular objectives of the research in the Institute? More broadly, to the objectives of progress in research or progress within the sociological enterprise?
Well, there's no one or easy answer to the question. There are 4 different criteria which come to mind in terms of trying to decide what kinds of projects ought to be pursued as proposals for funding. When people come to the Institute to ask for support, there are some rules of thumb. First of all, the subject matter. We try to give greater support to those projects which seem to be on the cutting edge of some shift or transformation in the society for the next decade. Now that makes a problem of prognostication. I mean, how does one know? What kind of criteria do you have? And I think one simply has to say, use your best judgment. If you've been studying sociology for many years, you ought to have some idea of what cutting-edge issues are for the society that you're living in. A lot of evidence against that, but still, it's an act of faith.
But this seems to me to relate very much to the world in which we live. The priorities of the research are very much related to the nature of the environment around us.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we come full circle to the issue of natural setting. If one is doing research on problems which are not current, which have little relevance to the contemporary scene, one would have very weak grounds, not much of a basis, for making the assessment of what are cutting-edge issues. One could be trapped in another century, another time frame, another intellectual set of issues, which are not germane to what's happening in society. Social change is about the currency of this period, so one has to be attuned at some level to contemporary issues. The natural setting provides at least the basis, not the only one, but the basis for talking about what might be an issue in the next decade.
Okay, fine. You suggested 4 criteria.
So the first one is the cutting edge, the notion that it's there's something that's happening in the society. Obviously, I take the Ahmad's example of new gene technology as an example. In the next decade, we will see extraordinary developments with first trimester diagnosis of pregnancies. That's clearly a cutting-edge issue in social change. Yeah. The next would be, what are the likelihoods, what are the chances that there might be some mobilization of social resources around these issues to transform them? That is, it's not simply an idle observation that something is at the cutting edge, but cutting edge and as well, political mobilization might shape, shift, direct, or transform the nature of the change. So the parallel criterion to cutting edge is, and with some clay there that one can perceive, with some malleability.
Right.
Now, the criteria now become much more fuzzy because an institute is a small place which has people who are compatible. And one or two projects which are incompatible in terms of either personality or source of funding become real issues. And so we look very closely at the kind of project, the funding source, and the integration with existing projects. The fact that we have 6 projects which are presently here already shapes the next criterion, namely, how good a fit will there be with the incoming program with what's already here. So we spend some time, usually at meetings, discussing whether this proposal, which we're reviewing, fits with the existing sets of projects.
Yeah, so I mean, the impression I'm getting is that the new, to a certain extent, new projects which are undertaken are influenced by the current body of projects.
No question about it.
Is there not some conflict then with changing prognostications?
Well, remember, these things are weighted differently. I mean, if someone comes in with a project that seems overwhelmingly competitive in terms of its cutting edge, then we may say that is sufficient. But I'm saying other things being equal. This is one of the 3 or 4 criteria.
Okay, fine.
Now, I suppose the last criterion is also in this area of judgment. It's not a question of us being able to say we do or we do not do this. It's a matter of judgment. And here's the question of perspective and orientation on the problem. If someone has a project which seems to be specific, local, and concerned with a particular topic, and is not broadened to the larger macro economic, political, social, cultural issues, then even though it might seem at one point to be having all the other criteria, it has less of a chance. That is, it's a tendency with ethnography, as you know, for people to become involved with their own work to the point where they're concerned only with that mental hospital or that bank or that clinic. And so unless they build into it wider layers of analysis and observation, unless they're concerned with such large matters which seem not to respect the ethnographic boundary of a lot of research, as demographic transition, workforce participation, changing character, the age-sex pyramid, things which seem to be outside of the realm of the Institute, in other words. That is, it would seem on the surface you say, well, the Institute is concerned with ethnography, field setting research. Why are they concerned with these other issues? It's because perhaps one of the major criteria here is that one contextualize the ethnographic work in these larger macroeconomic political scenes.
Okay. Just in one of your articles on the nature of the relationship between micro studies and macro studies, you seem to suggest that there is an aspect or aspects of reality that one can get at in natural setting studies, that it would, but that it would be a mistake to leave the matter there, and that one needs to have a broader framework, a macro framework, in order to understand a broader social reality. Could you give us an example of how you relate these particular local studies in the natural setting to this broader social reality?
Well, let's see if I can take example that's away from the particular concern here with the Institute. Say one is doing, or trying to do a study of mental illness, mental health. If you have a study of a clinic, you're looking at the delivery delivery of health services in this clinic, and you spend your 2, 3, 4 years looking at intake and clinical success or failure in, let's say, Oakland, Chinatown. You get a picture of Oakland, Chinatown. If, on the other hand, your orientation towards the mental health problem is at the national level, you'll spend time looking at national figures on mental health delivery, and you get an overview about patterns of usage of those facilities, but you won't have much of a sense of the texture of the experience. Now, what typically happens in social research on mental health, that people do one or the other. They'll either do a clinical study, they'll take a look at mental hospitals, they'll talk about the delivery of services, or they'll talk about grand national policy. They'll do a study of the mental health institutes and talk about patterns of utilization over 40 or 50 years in the country. Or they make a state, like Brimmer's study of the New York State mental hospital system. Now, I think any of those studies taken alone moderately interesting. But one begins to get a fuller picture of mental health, mental illness issues in the country if one tries to intersect at least 3 or 4 levels. So that you use the clinical setting to then talk about regional issues, perhaps the state issue, organizational, bureaucratic concerns, study of delivery of services in a larger section besides that clinic, health policy in general, and that will at some point take you to the national federal policy, to national law. But then one talks about drawing threads through mental health policy as it relates not only to Washington, but all the way down through local health bureaucracy into the clinical system.
Okay, fine. On the taking this further, one point further, you've commented, you've made the statement that you can relate the local studies in natural setting to this broader level in a way which will facilitate generalizations. Some sociologists have argued that the objective of sociology should be to predict future eventualities, to stipulate laws which will enable us to predict. Thinking about the distinction you've made, or the phrase that you used, generalization, how would you comment on the establishment of laws of prediction as an objective of sociology? How does it distinguish from generalization?
Well, it's a matter of emphasis. I don't think sociology can predict large and important social developments which are not in their control. I mean, one can talk about low-level predictions. If someone's status changes a certain number of levels, then they'll begin to consume in a different way. I mean, that kind of prediction can be made. But the predictions about the nature of social change, when and why people begin to move collectively, transform their condition, I think that that's probably outside of the realm, outside of the possibility of sociology, both contemporary and possibly in the next few centuries. So I think the generalization is aimed more at understanding social patterns as they're developing, not so much to predict the next 6 months or the next 6 years, but to talk about how one can begin to shape the nature and character of social policy and social life. But his prediction sounds to me like if things go along in this direction, then these things will happen. Another formulation is, if one has a general understanding of relationships, then the capacity to help shape those relationships will eventuate in some measure of prediction, but as you heard before, there are just too many variables to talk about the nature of a whole society.
You suggested that the variables are too large in number, in a way which prevents prediction for many years. Is it just a matter of degree? Thinking about, for example, laws in the natural science, is there a matter of degree
this distinction between the ability to predict and the ability to make generalizations, or is there something fundamentally different between the nature of society?
I think when one talks about society as an entity, the issue of emergence again, there's something fundamentally different. Now, as long as one is dealing with very small fragments of human behavior, if you increase your income this level, you'll behave this way. Or if you have this kind of income, you'll vote that way. If that's the level of prediction, then I think sociology probably can do fairly well.
Okay.
But that's not society. The unit of analysis is no longer this small unit. Society is configuration of actors, which is, by its nature, shifting in relationships. It's stratified, it's intricate, it's organizationally complex. Talk about predicting how that society is going to shift based upon a model of a natural scientist using a unit called an electron seems to me to be mindless. The nature of the unit, called the social organism, emergent, is so different in its character. One can talk about its contours, its shape, some of its complexities, but to think that one could predict its behavior like an electron seems to me beyond the pale. Now, I can say just two things about that, which may make it more than simply an assertion. Right?
Okay.
First one is that I think sociologists are dealing with a different conceptual problem. This has been said by many people in the philosophy of science before, but they disagree. So I'll just give you the basics for my assertion. I think that Alfred Schutz is correct, that sociologists are dealing with second-order constructs. That is, the best sociology deals with conceptualizations which are based upon prior conceptualizations of people in the society. But it is not the, quote, objective phenomena in the same sense. Because as one looks at the empirical world as a scientist, one simply makes a construction and calls that some phenomenon. The scientist is engaged in a first-order construction of the phenomenon. Sociologists are dealing with social organization. If they're sociologists, dealing with social organization. Social organization is itself a construction of actors in the scene. Thus, when sociologists go about their task of trying to apprehend, to get a handle on their subject matter, they're dealing with a second-order construct.
Yeah, that's right.
Thus, it is impossible to conceive of that second-order construct as having the same status in the epistemological sense now as a first-order construct.
Yeah.
So I would say there's a fundamental difference in the natural sciences and social sciences.
Okay. Okay, fine. Let's take two.
Well, you've suggested that really.
You can't make something mechanistic. You get all that out of what I've said, can't you?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Maybe it's two. Yeah.
And now on the question that Mary raises, I mean, I sort of alluded to that, but I haven't really. I'll talk more about the moral order than about morality, though.
What is the relationship
Is that
between
on?
moral order and morality?
It's on at the moment.
I see.
Oh, she's trying.
Yeah, he
It's
was.
spontaneous.
She's good. She's good.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you want to go? Well, tell us something a little more about the nature of the relationship between, the research that you do and social change itself. Given you've undertaken a large program of research, a number of different articles on the social framework of genetic screening, you may have produced a number of manifest truths or a number of very enlightening perspectives on the social framework. How does that relate to the social policy, to policy issues?
Well, I suppose it's one of the most important criteria for me in choosing a problem. It comes back to the question of what one sees and how one takes a stand on society as a order. And as I suggested in my remarks earlier, I think all societies are moral orders. It's not simply a question of explaining stratification based upon coercive power of the state. That's there. Every state has it, and depending upon the resources and sophistication, that mobilization capacity is used skillfully or not, successfully or not. But every state has that police power, that use of violence and force. But societies are also ordered over time because its members come to see their stratification in terms that are palatable. One chooses to live as opposed to die in glory, and chooses to live at the base of the structure as opposed to make an attempt to move against it. So one of the enduring questions for me in the choice of a problem is, what's the nature and character of the moral order? Not simply what are the objective structural conditions to explain that order. Now, it seems also to be a rather straightforward reason why I would take that view, namely, since all societies have these structural impediments for those involved to get to the top, what makes societies differ, what makes them interesting, is how some of them are able to change, how they, with some success, move against the established moral order and transform it, and why. So the basic question for me is, if any sociology that I'm undertaking is an elucidation, a clarification, maybe even a generalization of the problem of order from this point of view. Now, the structural components are not only a given, but they are a given that is so important that to ignore them would be a terrible mistake. So I take it as given that there are these structural impediments to change.
Mm-hmm.
How then does change occur, given the structural impediments? Now, one has to now go and perhaps take a look at and take seriously what those impediments are. But that wouldn't be the focus of my intellectual interest. My interest is in how actors collectively, and in some way which is not to be explained by looking at individuals, how they come to see their own involvement in, engagement in, complicity within a social and moral order. And of course, the parallel, how they come to move against it.
Okay, fine. Society is moral order. Society is also stratified, so individuals occupy different places within that moral order and sharing common certain values which are distinctive from those individuals or groups at different levels within that stratified society. Does not then the values, the position that one occupies and the values that one manifests from that position influence the nature of your perspectives on that moral order? The question I'm trying to get at is how does the individual's values come into play? What position do they take? What position? How do they influence the nature of the
Let me make
research?
sure I understand your question. How do the values of the individual researcher have an influence on the choice of questions that are researched, or how do the values of routine actors in social life affect how they see and act?
Not the former. How does the individual's values affect his or her assessments of the nature of that moral order?
I think they play a variable but often determining role. I mean, depending upon how self-conscious an actor is, he or she might say anything from, I'm a neutral observer, I'm only after the structural elements of the scene, as if they were a natural scientist. Or they may have some self-consciousness, in which case they may understand that they play a role in the moral order. Just by doing research, just by being a sociologist, just by existing, one has a position that one is probably either defending at some level, or perhaps trying to undermine at another. But I don't think that it's possible to talk about observers of human behavior as being independent from a clear assessment of their position on the moral order.
So, yeah, okay,
They
fine.
simply lack self-consciousness.
Okay, so you're saying that values necessarily come into play. How does that affect the nature of the research one undertakes? If there's a person at a different level undertaking a local study in a natural setting in a different place, it seems to me then that the results would be influenced very strongly by that individual's position within the moral order.
Yes, I understand.
How does that affect the nature of the research? How does one cater for taking that into account?
Listen, I've heard it said by some people that they would not undertake certain kinds of empirical studies because, they say, they're so deeply invested in the topic. I have a number of friends who are sociologists, acquaintances anyway, sociologists, and they say things like, well, look, I wouldn't undertake the study of, and I'll name an ethnic group that they're a member of, because I'm part of the ethnic group, and that would destroy my objectivity. Right? They will, however, undertake the study of some other ethnic group or some other social class or some other clinical situation because they're not part of it. Okay? Now, confronted with the argument that, well, they're part of some group, aren't they? A group called Americans. Won't they study Americans? Then, as you see, this is a continuum. This is not a binary question. We're all part of some group. So to make the argument that being a part of a group destroys my objectivity is a kind of intellectual gymnastics that may go in some kind of illogical fashion with some certain kinds of philosophical ruminations, but can't withstand the test of some basic empirical scrutiny. Yeah? We're all part of a group.
Okay.
So I don't see how one can say, well, because I'm not a member of this group, I am therefore more objective.
I agree with you, but I mean, can there be, if we are all members of groups, albeit at different levels within this moral order, can there be objectivity? Isn't there merely different perspectives
No.
on phenomena?
There are degrees of objectivity and degrees of objectivity. One can be so deeply invested in the established order that one's group position holds, so deeply invested, that even if they wanted to, they are not free actors. And at other points in history, that person's group can be in a different situation, and they then change their even subterranean, subconscious level of concern for the moral order. So I resist the formulation of your question. I resist the notion. There's something called an objective versus an objective orientation. There are degrees of subjectivity, or there are degrees of objectivity. And how close one is, for example, to, let's take a group that's very well placed historically, and let's say at the moment, very well placed structurally. And the social analysis is coming from that group. They're not threatened at all. Contrast that with a group member who is from another group that is threatened completely. Right? Now, to talk about one as being more objective or not makes some sense to me. But to say that one is or is not objective makes no sense.
Okay, fine. But how does this affect, I mean, how does one assess the extent to which the individual, the position that the different individuals who undertake research can be found in this moral order? I mean, are values to be made manifest? So you're suggesting that values are there. Are they to be made manifest in the research that's undertaken, in the reports?
Well, that's a question about normative injunction. I mean, ought people to be asked or required to make manifest their values? Perhaps they ought to in their...
Do you make manifest your values in the research?
I think on a continuum.
I mean,
Yes, that is, I explicitly say, often when I'm writing, why the question I'm writing about is important. it's important, and again, not simply in some abstract social theoretical way, that is the enduring questions of the 21st century, but rather it's important because in the next 20 to 30 years, there's an issue here about social transformation. Okay, so that's a rather clear statement about why I've chosen this topic. I didn't just choose it to further some abstract notion of knowledge, abstract knowledge in behalf of some possible understanding of dislocation, resource mobilization, social change.
It's been suggested, for example, in research in the natural sciences, that the imposition of values is reprehensible. You seem to be suggesting that values are in social science are inevitable and maybe in some ways beneficial. Is this the case? Ought one to bring into play one's values?
Well, because values are not the only thing that comes into play. That is, when social scientists do research, they also ostensibly are producing something, and the production is as much subject of our interest and our scrutiny as the values which generated the work. So I don't think it's only a matter of just juxtaposing different people's values and saying, oh, your value is different, some more explicit than, or better than mine. But now that I've understood the source of the question in the research, I look at the consequences called the research, and I'll make my assessment. Now, the natural scientists, as I said earlier, have a very different epistemological problem to deal with. The assessment of their work is done by their colleagues primarily, and the consequences for the society may be dramatic in terms of whether or not there's a corporation waiting in the wings to market the product, or it may have no bearing. That is, it may be a product that's not marketable. But that's a different order of question. And whether or not people are standing over the natural scientist's shoulder, raising questions about the very conceptualization at the first order of the construction. So I don't think the natural scientists have any clue about this question of the role of values in the choice of their problems. They are, at that point, the laity on their own social organization of knowledge. You talk to natural scientists about their work, they typically have an understanding of the philosophy of science that is relatively naive.
Okay.
I want to just shift fields to a completely different, in a sense, realm, and that's more or less the practice of research. And you've been on a lot of funding boards and review boards for national institutes and stuff. And my question would be, just to give us some idea within what the normative establishment formation of funding and how they go about reviewing, and what does that mean for establishing research programs, so to speak.
Well, funding boards, whether it's the private sector with Ford, Carnegie, or it's the public sector with National Science Foundation, and Institute of Health in Washington, all of them have a very similar problem. And that is accountability. They want to be able to explain to themselves and to the broader constituency, the public, that what they've done is to produce a research funding that's defensible. The last thing they want to do is to give money to a project that gets laughed at. Right? So they've established something called peer review. Peer review is an easy thing to understand. You get people who have more or less achieved some name for themselves in the field, and then they're asked to come and make assessments whether or not this research should go on. Peer review, therefore, is like peer review on the journals. It is both a floor and a ceiling. It's a floor, meaning that your peers are not going to let certain things get published or reviewed for positive funding, which falls below the consensual validation of the peers, right? They guarantee that floor. But they also guarantee a ceiling. That is, you're not going to be able to raise certain kinds of questions which throw into a problematic light the fundament of disciplinary orientation. Mm-hmm. So funding boards are basically narrowing boxes which shape the nature of a disciplinary act called research in dramatic ways that I think do well in some fields, certain points of history, but also can crush a field. Because if the peers wind up trying to hold the fort against some alternative, like let's say when I was talking about physics in the early 70s, or biology perhaps a little earlier period, you don't get a lot of creative, imaginative research.
And because how would that, given that structure, how does that affect the type of research which is done at the Institute? Because in a sense it is not the normative type of research which we would find. It doesn't do the surveys, it doesn't do what is considered the science of social science.
Well, rather clearly, funding agents in Washington look upon natural setting research or academic research as being preliminary, as I said before. So they make the fundamental mistake of not seeing that certain kinds of entries into the empirical world are the only way of the apprehension of that empirical world, therefore the only scientific enterprise. Right? They have reified the instrument. They see the quantitative method of investigation as scientific. Therefore, they see places like this as anything from misguided to pre-scientific. Either we're not sophisticated enough to understand about path analysis, so forth, or we're doing something which is at stage one of a four-stage rocket. My guess is that there are two different kinds of answers here. One is that survey research has priced itself out of the market in many ways. That it costs nearly $1 million to do a national survey these days. So they find this place possibly interesting every now and again because they find an alternative and a cheaper way of doing certain kinds of research. But the answer to your question is that my guess is in the next decade, this institute and others which have some similarity will probably have a limited lifespan. Very limited.
So strategically, how would, if acknowledging those limits, strategically, what does one do about it if they are interested in that type of research, besides, hoping for...
I mean, that's tenure at a place like Berkeley. You're describing it, what would happen if someone were in this line of inquiry and didn't have tenure already.
Right. Strategically, how does one, are there any ways to deal with it besides, hoping for...
There will be, I think, the swing of the pendulum. I mean, I've already hinted that the survey research pricing out of the field makes it very plausible for funding agents or perhaps even smaller local scenes like labor unions or whoever else might be hiring sociologists in the next decade to deal with the onslaught. I think that it's quite possible that this kind of research, all you need is a pencil and paper. You can do interesting and important work. If you need the fancy high tech, you probably have to bow and bend to powerful interests.
Is there not something, you suggested that the natural setting research is superior in many instances?
Yeah, we should make that caveat. I mean,
Okay, with regard to specific types of questions, specific types of problems posed, is there nothing compelling about the nature of this type of research which makes it manifestly better than survey research? Is there a matter of the practicalities of what the more general impression about the nature of scientific research is?
Well, remember, I keep emphasizing it depends upon the question you're asking. If what you want to know is, at this point in time, what these faculty members think about this health plan. Right? That's what you want to know. And I have no doubt that a survey technique in a large factory of, let's say, 5,000 workers is probably the best instrument for that question. I mean, I don't have any doubt about that. I may be wrong, but this was the moment I would say, use that instrument. So I don't want to celebrate field research. I simply want to say that depending upon the question that you're raising, for me, most of the time, it should be at the core of one's research interest. Now, by core, I don't mean exclusive. I mean, I've tried to be, both in my own work and trying to support the work of others, somewhat ecumenical and say that after you establish the basic formulations in the field, then you really ought to expand and use surveys, demography, census data. I mean, you name it. I don't throw any of it out. And I think the complementarity should exist, but often, as I said, around the core of field investigation. Now, if you raise the question, why is field core for me? Then it has to do with my earlier discussion. But social order is moral order, and the field will permit you access and entry into the phenomenological constructions of reality, common sense actors, which you can't get, it seems to me, in as much texture and detail if you're asking someone in a 2-hour interview for their views. For example, you've been interviewing me now for about an hour. What I've said to you is, in many ways, a distilled construction of some thought processes. I'm pulling together, many years of work. I'm putting it into your lap and onto this cellular, right? But
And also
that construction is clearly a very partial representation of what I do in my research and description of the Institute. If you wanted to really understand what happens at the Institute, I would suggest
apply to the Institute for a grant.
you spend 6 or 8 months hanging out at the front desk, checking out what goes on at seminars, spending a little time on a research project for a few weeks here and there, talking to people. I think your understanding of the Institute would be so much richer than this hour-and-a-half interview. Now, to say that the interview is therefore not valuable, it's dumb. The interview has its functions. But when sociologists take the interview to stand for the empirical world, they make a fundamental mistake. Fundamental mistake.
I agree. So there you have it. Okay.
I got my florist in.
Right. That's a great ending.
You as an example of promise.
Yeah, I was just thinking, nobody's done that yet.
That's great. I think that's perfect with respect